there aren't too many African Americans on the west side of Cleveland, so it's a little bit of a little bit misleading. As we go from 70 to 80 to 90 to 2000, we'll do it again real fast, 70, 80, 90, 2000, you see there's this kind of radial direction outward. And so what that means is that it's not as though blacks are sort of filling in all of a ring, they're just moving out across rings. And so when you measure the average in any one ring, there's kind of the same percentage as you keep going further and further out. This is Chicago, and anybody who knows Chicago knows that the black population is focused mostly on the south side of the central city, and then there's a strip on the west side. And so you can kind of see that. This is 80, 90, and 2000, again, 70, 80, 90, 2000. And again, there's this kind of, these radial patterns that go out. So that's the pattern for African Americans, and we haven't done any real statistical analysis of this, but we think it would be there. The pattern for Latinos and Asians is pretty different. Here's Latinos as we go through time, and by the time you get to 2000, it's this kind of scattered checkerboardy pattern. So there's not a real clustering out in radial patterns that you would see, again, 70, 80, 90, 2000. This is Washington, D.C. for blacks, and it's anybody who knows D.C. knows that the black population is all in Peachey County and the eastern counties of D.C. You can really see it as you go through time, 70, 80, 90, 2000. There's these patterns that go out to the east and to the south. For Hispanics, again, keep an eye on those two little places. I don't know what they are. They really become the nodes in this much more diffuse kind of dispersion. 70, 80, 90, 2000. Asians is also this kind of more scattered pattern. Here's 1980, 1990, and 2000. And you can see that they're just kind of really dispersed throughout, right?
Which city is this again?
This is Washington, D.C., sorry. 70, 80, 90, 2000, okay? So essentially we have two different kinds of patterns. For blacks, it's this kind of radial pattern, and for Asians and Hispanics, it's a much more scattered sort of pattern. Finally, I have these four graphs, and then I'll wrap up. I don't think there's a whole lot more to say. This is showing the change over time. So you can see that in 1970, the average central city was about 80% white. That's declined to just over 60%. And the other thing to note is that the average metropolitan area had this very pronounced downward ecological distance gradient for whites. In other words, it got less and less white as you went out. That has to do with the fact that there were a lot of rural populations, especially black populations, that became suburban because their counties were added to metropolitan areas. By 2000, you see this upward sloping trend, which is sort of what you think of as being common, that the first ring of suburbs is not so white, and then as you go further and further out, it gets more white. The pattern for blacks is the reverse. In 1970, there were very low percentages of blacks in the first ring, because I said most of them were clustered in the central city. And because of this kind of weird way in which rural counties were added to become metropolitan, there's actually an upward sloping gradient in 1970, and that has shifted to 2000 to be downward sloping, which is what you'd expect again with lots of minorities in the early or inner rings and fewer and fewer as you get further out. The story for Latinos and Asians isn't really so clear. It's not much of a story. It's just an increasing percentage of each group, but kind of proportionally all the same across the different suburban rings. So the basic findings from the metropolitan area level are that there are these big region effects. So for Latinos and Asians especially, in the West, the first ring gaps are smaller. In other words, there's not such a differentiation between the central city and the first ring of suburbs. And if you think about it, if you know anything about LA, that sort of fits with what you would know, that central city LA and then the first ring of suburbs, there's not a whole lot of difference in the Latino population. But the ecological distance gradients get much more negative. In other words, Latinos haven't spread very far out into the furthest ring of suburbs in cities like Los Angeles. And for blacks, these gradients are more positive in the West. In other words, blacks are able to translate their mobility in the economic mobility to further and further out locations. So essentially, what we've decided is that this inner ring idea is a little bit overstated. It misses the fact that it isn't the case, again, that minorities will fill in all of an inner ring and then move out. It's that especially blacks will occupy a couple of suburbs in the first ring, and then a couple of suburbs in the second ring, and then a couple more in the third ring, and they move out in kind of a radial way. On the other hand, inner ring suburbs might be bigger in terms of population, so it might be the case that most African Americans who experience the suburbs experience living in one of the inner ring suburbs, which are disadvantaged in a number of ways. It's also true, we don't show this here, but it's also true that segregation in the suburbs is still really high. There are lots of suburbs that are just black suburbs, and suburbs that are Latino suburbs, and suburbs that are white suburbs. And finally, Western metropolitan areas are more open in general. However, high levels of what we think is going on is that there's still continuing high levels of immigration from Latin America and Asia, such that central cities and inner ring suburbs in the West are still heavily dominated by Latinos and Asians, and so therefore they're not as obviously diffusing and dispersing throughout metropolitan areas. Okay, thank you.